In this video, we're going to be conducting an algebra review to better prepare ourselves for physics. In front of you, we have 6 different physics formulas and a bunch of different variables. Now, if you're taking a look at all these physics formulas and it looks really complicated to you, that's okay. Don't be intimidated. For this activity, all we're doing is just doing a little bit of algebra. So you actually don't have to know what any of these variables stand for or what they mean. Our first 4 questions are going to be a little bit more simple. We're going to actually plug in number values and get a final numerical answer. And then for 5 and 6, we have 2 slightly more complicated formulas where we're just going to be manipulating the variables. Okay, so what I would recommend is to pause the video in a few seconds here so that it will give you some time to work out numbers 1 through 4. And then when you've completed numbers 1 through 4, then go ahead and play the video again so you can see the solutions worked out. All right, so go ahead and begin your work for 1 through 4. All right, so I've completed our first 4 questions. If you take a look at number 1 is a step that I commonly do with a lot of my physics problems, and I would say it's something that's not very typical of most people when they are doing some algebra to solve physics problems. So I went ahead and set up S equals d over t. If you take a look at all of my solutions and my work, I don't have any units. In physics, units are very, very important, but that's not the emphasis of the activity we're doing now, so I just wrote the numbers. But normally you definitely want to make sure you have the units, especially for your final solution. All right, so with that being said, we have our setup for number 1. It's 5 equals 3 over t. Now with cross multiplying, people typically think of cross multiplying with 2 fractions, right? So if you're thinking about cross multiplying, I'll go ahead and write up here. If you have 5 over x equals 3 over y, then a lot of times you think of cross multiplying as a step where you can move the 5 down over to where the y is, or the y up over where the 5 is, and then same thing for these over here. Okay, so I think that's something that most people are pretty familiar with. Now the thing about cross multiplying is you can have two things move over, or you can have one thing move over. So for the first one, I did actually want t to move up and over, and then 5 to drop down, and then that basically finished our entire problem. You just want to make sure that anytime something is in the denominator, when you cross it over, it goes up, and then if something is not in the denominator, then you can basically consider it in the numerator, and then it drops right down. So then we end up with t equals 3 over 5, which is the same thing as 0.6. For number 2, we have 100 equals 1/2 8 times v squared. The first thing I want to do is kind of clean it up a little bit to make it look a little neater. I took 1/2 and multiplied it by 8, and I just wrote that as 4. Then I divided both sides by 4 to cancel my 4, and then your last step is to go ahead and square root both sides to get rid of this squared for next to the v, and then v equals 5. For number 3, this one is slightly more complicated. You see my setup over here, and then I simplified it. There's one step that might be a little confusing if I don't explain it. It's where I went from this first row to the second row. So we have 15 because I haven't done anything yet. 2 times 3 is 6, and then I have plus 2a. So if you're wondering where I got the 2a from, it's because if you take 2 squared, that's 4, and you multiply it by 1/2, it makes it 2. Okay, so when you're multiplying numbers, it doesn't matter what order they're in. So I went ahead and then I took my 1/2 and my 2 squared, which is 4, and I went ahead and multiplied those first. So again, I kind of just cleaned up the look of what I was doing. I subtracted 6 from both sides, and then I finished off by dividing by 2, and I got 4.5. For our last one of our first part, we have 3 equals 8 minus vi, and this is where I was talking about that cross multiplying step that could be sort of quick and useful. If you want to cross something over, you don't necessarily have to cross the 2 up and the 3 down. I only cross the 2 up and over because I want to move everything away from my vi. So my final answer says vi equals some number. So it's not beneficial for me to scoot the 3 down over here. So I cross the 2 up and over, which is basically the same exact thing as multiplying both sides by 2. And then 2 times 3 equals 6 equals 8 minus vi. Okay, so I'm going to subtract 8 from both sides, which leaves me with negative 2 on the left side, and I still have this minus sign here, so that's something you don't want to forget about. So that basically makes this a negative vi, and then since we have a negative on both sides, the negatives are going to drop out, and your vi equals 2. All right, now for our last couple problems, these ones are a lot more complicated. So if you're pretty sure you're not going to be working at this level where you're just manipulating variables, you can go ahead and stop now. If you're working at an honors or AP level, then you'll for sure need to be able to manipulate variables like I'm about to do. All right, so if you would like to, you can go ahead and pause the video right now and work on 5 and 6. And then when you're ready, you can play it again, and then you can see the solutions worked out. Okay, so go ahead and begin work for 5 and 6. Okay, I've completed our last two problems. I went ahead and switched to a new screen so that we'd have more room to work out these more complex problems. But if you want to go back and look at the solutions of 1 through 4, you can skip back to any point slightly before 8 minutes and 50 seconds if you want to take a look at the solutions of 1 to 4. All right, so now when you're working with these last two problems, you're just manipulating the variables. People find that to be challenging sometimes because they're used to working with numbers, so their level of comfort is probably not quite there, just moving around variables. All right, so one of the first things I did is I took this capital G and I just put it up in the numerator, because for me that kind of looked a little bit nicer. Anytime you're multiplying by anything, it's like the same thing as putting it in the numerator. So I did my cross multiplying step that you saw me do in a lot of the other problems. I flipped my r squared up and over to the left, and I took my f and I dropped it into the denominator on the right side, which worked out nicely for me. So because I have r almost completely isolated, it's actually an r squared. And then I square rooted both sides to get rid of my squared, and then I was left with r equals the square root of g m1 m2 over f. For my last one, that is definitely the most complex one that we've seen yet. If you're not familiar with these signs, it doesn't really matter, but I'm just going to reference them. So I want to make sure you know what I'm talking about. This little W sign is an omega. This little A here is an alpha. And then the little circle with the line through it is a theta. All right, so I just rewrote everything out. The first step I did was I subtracted the omega I squared from both sides. And then that left me with omega f squared minus omega I squared. Then I divided each side by 2 alpha, so I put a 2 alpha right underneath that quantity. And then from there, I subtracted my theta f. And then you want to make sure you're careful about rewriting this, because it's this whole entire chunk of variables together that it has this theta f subtracted from it. And that equals negative theta I. Okay, so remember, we have this minus sign here, so it's basically like a negative value. Now from there, what I did is to get my positive theta I and my final solution, I multiplied everything by -1. So basically just changing the sign on everything. So I multiplied this side by -1, which basically dropped the negative. And then when I do that to the other side to make sure everything is equal, that places a negative in front of this big quantity here. And then that changed my minus sign to a plus sign in front of my theta f. And that concludes our final problem. All right, so hopefully this video was helpful in sharpening up your algebra skills and manipulating variables. So thank you for watching and listening.